The title of my presentation is Responding to Possibilities and Constraints Imposed by the COVID-19 Pandemic. In my earlier lecture, back in October, I introduced Levinthal's common sense model of healthcare and the need to balance danger control and fear control or emotion control. I also noted that the pandemic offers us possibilities and constraints. There's an upside in a certain ironic way. We all know about the constraints from lockdowns and health threats and so forth in our communities. But I'm going to talk about the possibilities offered by literature and media more broadly, and offer a particular take on how one engages with literature and media in a positive manner. Now, let me share with you, since October when I first spoke, we've done a number of studies on the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to the lives of students and community members. First, we gave a survey out to 10,000 students at the University of Toronto as a professor of psychology. That's my focus, with philosophical concerns as well. 859 completed it, and I learned a great deal about this issue of responding and coping with COVID-19. I know all of us in our universities, the struggles of our students, the responsibilities that we bear for our students whom we mentor in our universities and even in other countries. We found two kinds of groups of interest in this data: at-risk students and resilient students. Let me describe the at-risk, and I'm laying the foundations for my later development of ideas, as you shall soon see. At-risk students describe themselves as being in poor health and potentially having COVID. They're having difficulty focusing on everyday activities due to anxiety and financial concerns. They're in a negative emotional state. They're lacking self-confidence. They're getting their information about COVID from social media platforms rather than news resources. They're lacking physical support in the home. Remember, at the campus I teach on, I teach more students from more parts of the world with more skin colors than one can imagine. The burdens of responsibility in their families weigh upon their shoulders. They see their futures in a negative light. And interestingly, they're less likely to follow precautionary activities, keeping 2 meters distance, covering the face, engaging in community activities. And what's especially important here, they know it. They realize that they're not engaging in these activities. They describe themselves at home and at school, and they appear to be burned out from coping with the high demands and the absence of support. From our viewpoint, as I laid out in October, they're lacking emotion control in the face of the dangers burdening them. They lack ego strength. They're living in a bubble. That is the card that I put on the table. How do I help my students living in this bubble to take control of their lives? And of course, in contrast, we have the high resilience students. Positive self-concept, positive mood. They don't see themselves as being in poor health. They're seeking credible information from the news, not just social media, a leitmotif that in other contexts would be deemed very important. They have emotional support from home and friends. This will be part of my theme later on. They adopt many ways to face challenges. They're sensitive to the changes and diminished resources available to them. Look at that contrast. The at-risk student and the resilient student. In what way do I bring literature to bear here? So I have 2 of my students engaged in research on what's the role of creative activities and artistic activities. It can be drawing, it can be writing, it can be storytelling with friends. How does this pertain to coping with the disaster of the pandemic? So one student looks at the role of aesthetic activities. Excuse me, I asked her, I said, send me your best findings. What are the most important things that we learn? And I speak of the creative undergraduate from different communities upon whose shoulders I entrust the task of studying their confrères. And look at the beautiful work that they can do. Now, look what we learned from one student, Helen Chan. Reflecting on past activities and adversities helps individuals engage in self-care. Reflecting on past activities, reflecting upon, again, a theme I will build toward the end. Being in flow before the pandemic meant individuals were likely to cope better with feelings of stress and isolation through therapeutic art making. Again, these are leitmotifs pertaining to where I'm going. In the flow, self-care, creative activities. When artists identified with art making and shared their art with the community before the pandemic, they are likely to use art to reflect and navigate through their emotions during the pandemic. Reading might be relevant here. How do we navigate our emotions? What is our relationship to our communities? So not all negative. Skills that are learned, aspects of resilience. What's a constraint? We found that placing a strong importance on flow. Flow is a very important concept in creative literature in the West through the research of Csikszentmihalyi, whose name I can never spell. Okay. Placing a strong importance on flow before the pandemic was perceived as less essential to art making during the pandemic. Attention shifted to self-care. Self-care in literature, self-care in community. How does self-care emerge as a productive theme? Another study done by an Albanian student of mine, Julie Sedini, where the students could tell you whatever project they chose. And these papers are going to go out for publication shortly. And we have beautiful stories providing people with an opportunity to tell their stories from specific episodes of their lives has proven to be a wonderful research technique I cannot underscore enough. So this is what Julie finds. Creative activities of all kinds. Doing a creative activity to feel connected with others was associated with having more positive emotions. Creative activities and feeling connected. All these little themes as I move through will fit into the story I tell in the end. Having a positive outlook toward the pandemic and viewing this as a time for doing good things fostered creative activity. So the attitude of the student, of our fellow persons, is crucial in times of stress. And what are the constraints? Having more negative feelings about the pandemic was related to choosing an activity for intrinsic reasons. We have found that in the face of the pandemic, in the face of stresses, people turn inward to their imaginations. Is this not where we encounter literature? Participants who felt more anxiety about the pandemic turned to activities such as writing poetry or painting for cathartic reasons. Let me summarize there and add that we are doing the first global study of freelancing, including representatives from India. And all these freelancers are impacted by the opportunities of working from home. They're impacted by the fears that they all have around the world, not just students, but adults in research. And we all have to acknowledge this transition. Look at how we're meeting. In normal circumstances, we might be together in a ballroom, in a lecture theater. And here we have all learned to teach our students online. We have all developed a community online of sharing meaning across the world without even having to pack a suitcase, though I regret not being in India for dinner. So what's my take? I've done research on students at the university and coping with the pandemic. Some are living in a bubble of isolation. On the other hand, when it comes to creative activities, people are finding a way. So how does this relate to literature? How do you kindly bring me into your world so I can offer a prescription for survival in the pandemic? Following the reader response tradition, and the reader response tradition is as follows, and it will remind you of your own childhoods in university. Remember in high school when the teacher told you the official meaning of a text, and if you deviated from what the teacher said, you lost points on your exam. The people who felt this founded an association of which I became president in 2000. The tradition of reader response does not focus on the text in isolation. It focuses on our relationship to the text. And I would add our relationship with others in the context of a text. So I asked in my earlier lecture, how deeply do we enter the fictional text? It can be nonfiction as well. And I've contrasted a surface orientation for distraction. I'm bored. I need to feel some warmth. I might find a romantic text that I go through, and I'm floating on the surface of the characters, wondering how the action story will end, feeling the love that they share for each other or the animosity that might reflect my family. I'm surfacing on the text, surfing the text. And I spoke about deeper reading and emotional elaboration. And now I move to the heart of my talk. The deeper reading and emotional elaboration pertains to my life. And it is here that the bridge is built in the context of the pandemic, with the elements of literature that describe the worlds of others and come closer to home. And learning from my students again, I might write my own story about my feeling about the pandemic, stimulated by a text. There's a whole world out there of students and people who are engaging in fan fiction, who take a character or an episode from one of their favorite TV programs or books and follow that character. I underscore the value of following the character and creating the character that resonates with the deeper meanings in my life. And here, as I come close to the point, we make a contrast in literature between concrete description and symbolic description. And in our research on story making, we have found that those who are oriented to growth in their lives and those who bring a positive feeling to the creative writing task, their stories are more symbolic. They're not just concrete descriptions. And how do I learn from this in relation to the pandemic? The stories that we understand, the stories that we write can resonate with the fears that we have inside, offering the opportunity for catharsis, for spillage of these emotions. My students who are living in the bubble, in the isolation of the home, where they have so many responsibilities, are bound up within their own fears. I will shortly create a video for them, welcoming them to exit. And here's another point about the literature. When we read, we do not read alone. When we read, we can be members of reading groups. We can be members of writing groups. So what do I have to say in the end about disaster literature? Disaster literature shares with us events in the great past of our own people or those of others, to which we might resonate because of personal meanings that are echoing in our lives in the tragedy of the moment that we read in the papers, losses in our family, losses in the families of friends. What is the role of literature here? The role of literature is it provides us an opportunity to escape the tragedies that surround us in the immediate moment and enter, as Coleridge would have us, with the willing suspension of disbelief into the realities of other people's lives and those of our own. And what do I say in closing? When we read or write or see media, it's not just about literature, and go into this magical world of the creative domain, we have the opportunity to bring our emotions out, to take the fears we have inside us and understand that we are not alone. This is the message for my at-risk students. We are not alone. You guys in India are suffering. We are suffering here in Toronto. In the act of recognizing the suffering of the other, of feeling the empathy, of not feeling isolated. And here's the point. We are in a position to move to a transcendental state of awareness, of reflections of our own lives and on our own lives and those of others, because we are not alone. So just as we might go to the doctor to get the pill or the hospital to try to save us in the moment of crisis, I say in the end that literature is the pill of life because it opens a door and permits our feelings to come out. Because in sharing our world with others and learning of the worlds of others, we are not alone, even in the midst of a pandemic. So yes, there are the constraints of the pandemic. We are in a lockdown. We cannot see our friends. We don't have our social world. And yet literature offers us the romantic opportunity to remove ourselves from isolation, to share our feelings with others, and to empathize with our there. Healing and literature go hand in hand.